Welcome to today's story. Imagine being called a single word that could ignite a war. In 1960s New York, when mobsters allegedly disrespected Muhammad Ali, one man in Harlem wasn't about to let it slide. The legendary Bumpy Johnson saw it as more than an insult. It was a challenge to pride, power, and respect. What happened next would shock both the streets and the underworld. Stick around because this story is packed with true accounts, secrets, and tensions that almost no one talks about. Where history, respect, and power collide in one of the most shocking underworld legends, the moment a mob crowd allegedly disrespected Muhammad Ali and Harlem kingpin Bumpy Johnson wasn't having it. Before we begin, let me know in the comments where you're watching from. And please subscribe, because these stories take hours of digging through true historical accounts, crime archives, verified sources to separate myth from fact and bring you the most authentic narrative possible. Now imagine the atmosphere of 1960s New York, tension in the streets, organized crime influence everywhere, and Muhammad Ali rising as a global icon who stood for dignity and pride. During a reported encounter involving mob-connected figures, a disrespectful remark calling Allah boy crossed a line that, in that era, carried deep racial and cultural weight. For many, it was more than an insult. It was a direct challenge to status and respect. Bumpy Johnson, who commanded enormous influence in Harlem and maintained complex ties with the Italian-American Mafia, was known for enforcing respect above all else. Stories suggest that when word of the insult reached him, he saw it not just as disrespect toward a boxer, but toward the community Ali symbolized. The situation allegedly escalated into tension involving members of the powerful Genovese crime family, one of the 5 families that dominated organized crime in New York. Whether literal, war, or a strategic show of power, the narrative reflects how reputation, alliances, and street authority operated in the shadow world of mid-20th century America. At a time when Ali represented resistance and pride, and Bumpy represented Harlem's protection and influence. Even a single word could ripple through criminal and cultural power structures. To truly understand this story, we first have to understand the massive rise of Muhammad Ali in the 1960s, because he was not just a boxer. He was becoming a global symbol. In an era where boxing was dominated by quiet, disciplined champions, Ali entered the spotlight with unmatched charisma, confidence, and a voice that demanded attention. He wasn't just winning fights, he was rewriting how athletes presented themselves to the world, speaking boldly about identity, pride, and dignity at a time when such openness was rare and often controversial. When he defeated Sonny Liston in 1964, the world witnessed more than an upset. It was the birth of a cultural phenomenon. Ali's victory shocked the boxing establishment, but what followed was even more influential. His poetic trash talk, rhythmic predictions, and fearless personality transformed sports entertainment. He became a media magnet, and every appearance, interview, and public moment amplified his image as a fearless young champion who refused to conform to traditional expectations placed on black athletes of that era. His rise also coincided with the civil rights movement in the United States, which made his presence even more significant. Ali's confidence and refusal to be submissive challenged deeply rooted social norms. At a time when many public figures avoided political or racial discussions, he openly spoke about pride in his identity and beliefs. This made him both admired and criticized, but it undeniably increased his influence far beyond the boxing ring and into global cultural conversations. Another turning point in his influence was his public alignment with the Nation of Islam, which shocked mainstream America. Changing his name from Cassius Clay to Muhammad Ali was not just a personal decision. It was a powerful statement about self-definition and resistance to imposed identity. This move elevated him from sports star to political and cultural icon, making him a figure that commanded attention from communities, media, and even powerful organizations, including those connected to the underworld. By the mid-1960s, Ali's popularity extended into major cities like New York, Chicago, and Los Angeles, where his presence attracted enormous crowds. Harlem, in particular, saw him as more than a champion. He was viewed as a symbol of pride and empowerment. His visits to black communities were treated like major events, and influential local figures, including businessmen and power brokers, recognized the cultural value of being associated with him. At the same time, his outspoken nature made him controversial among traditional elites and certain organized power circles. Unlike many athletes who remained neutral and compliant, Ali spoke directly, joked boldly, and refused to be intimidated by status or authority. This unique mix of celebrity, defiance, and cultural influence meant that any public interaction involving him carried weight, especially in environments where respect and hierarchy were taken very seriously. Ultimately, Muhammad Ali's rise in the 1960s was not just about boxing titles. It was about influence, symbolism, and presence. He represented a new kind of global figure, fearless, vocal, and culturally transformative. By the time stories like the alleged mob disrespect began circulating, Ali was no longer just an athlete. He was a powerful icon whose dignity, image, and respect mattered deeply to communities, public figures, and even individuals operating within the shadowy power structures of that era. In the 1960s, racial tensions in New York were not just a social issue, but a deeply embedded reality that shaped everyday interactions, power structures, even the behavior of organized crime circles. The city was undergoing major demographic and cultural shifts, with African American communities in areas like Harlem asserting stronger cultural identity, while still facing systemic discrimination in housing, employment, and law enforcement. Respect, language, and public treatment carried enormous weight, especially in public spaces where social hierarchies were constantly being reinforced. At the same time, organized crime families such as the Genovese crime family operated with significant influence across various boroughs, including areas economically tied to Harlem. While these Mafia organizations were primarily focused on business, territory, and profit, they also functioned within the racial climate of the era, which meant their interactions with black communities were often shaped by the broader prejudices of the time. This created an environment where respect was unevenly distributed and tensions could quietly build beneath the surface. Harlem itself stood as a cultural and political hub for Black America, but it was also economically entangled with underground networks, gambling operations, and informal power brokers. Figures like Bumpy Johnson operated in a unique position, balancing relationships between local communities and Italian-American mafia families. This balance was delicate because while cooperation existed for business purposes, social equality did not necessarily accompany those alliances. The power dynamics were complex, layered with both mutual dependence and underlying racial divisions. Language played a particularly sensitive role during this era. Terms that might have been dismissed casually in other contexts carried deeply offensive connotations in racially charged environments. Being called boy toward a grown black man, especially a public figure, was widely understood as a degrading term rooted in segregation-era attitudes. In cities like New York, where identity and reputation were fiercely defended, such language could quickly escalate tensions, particularly when used in spaces connected to authority or influence. Public figures were especially vulnerable to symbolic disrespect because their treatment reflected broader societal attitudes. When someone like Muhammad Ali entered elite or mob-adjacent social environments, he was not just seen as an athlete, but as a representation of rising black pride and defiance. His bold personality, refusal to conform, and growing political voice made him both admired and controversial, meaning any perceived slight against him could resonate far beyond the immediate moment. The streets of New York in that decade were also shaped by unwritten codes of respect that overlapped with both community leadership and underworld etiquette. Organized crime figures valued hierarchy and public image, while black community leaders demanded dignity in a society that often denied it. When these two worlds intersected, even small incidents involving language, posture, or tone could be interpreted as larger statements about power and social standing. Ultimately, racial tension in mob-influenced New York was not always expressed through open conflict, but through subtle interactions, coded language, and social positioning. It was a city where alliances existed out of necessity, yet cultural divides remained strong. In such an environment, any perceived disrespect toward a figure as prominent and symbolic as Muhammad Ali could be interpreted not just as a personal insult, as a reflection of the deeper racial dynamics shaping the social and power landscape of 1960s New York. In the landscape of 1960s Harlem, authority did not always come from official titles or political offices, but from influence, reputation, the ability to maintain order in a community facing economic hardship and social inequality. This is where Bumpy Johnson emerged as a dominant figure, not merely as an underworld operator, but as someone many locals viewed as a power broker who understood the realities of the neighborhood. His presence was deeply tied to Harlem's informal systems of protection, business, and negotiation. Bumpy Johnson's authority was built over decades, particularly through his strategic role in Harlem's numbers racket, an underground lottery system that functioned as both an economic engine and a social structure within the community. While illegal, it provided jobs, financial circulation, and a sense of organized stability in areas where mainstream economic opportunities were limited. This allowed Johnson to cultivate loyalty among residents who saw him as someone who reinvested influence back into the neighborhood rather than exploiting it entirely. His power also stemmed from his ability to navigate relationships with major mafia organizations, especially the Genovese crime family, which controlled large portions of organized crime in New York. Unlike many independent operators, Johnson did not operate in isolation. Instead, he maintained a calculated balance of cooperation and autonomy. This relationship allowed him to retain authority in Harlem while avoiding direct territorial conflict with larger crime families. Beyond criminal enterprises, Johnson cultivated an image of intellectualism and discipline that distinguished him from stereotypical gang figures of the time. He was known to read extensively, memorize poetry, and present himself with a composed demeanor that commanded respect in both street and high-level criminal circles. This cultivated persona reinforced his leadership image, making him someone whose words and reactions carried significant weight across multiple social layers. Within Harlem, his influence extended into community protection and dispute resolution. Many local businesses, performers, and public figures relied on informal protection systems that Johnson's network helped manage. In neighborhoods where trust in formal institutions was often low, figures like him filled the vacuum by enforcing order through reputation and personal authority rather than official law enforcement structures. His standing was also symbolic in a racial context. During a time when black leaders were often marginalized in mainstream power systems, Johnson represented a rare form of localized black authority in a city dominated by larger external power groups. This gave him a unique position. He was both a negotiator with powerful organizations and a figure seen as a defender of dignity within Harlem's cultural identity. Ultimately, Bumpy Johnson's authority in Harlem was not just about criminal influence, but about balance, perception, and control. He operated at the intersection of community leadership, underground economics, and organized crime diplomacy. In an era defined by respect codes and rigid hierarchies, his reputation meant that any event involving prominent figures connected to Harlem's pride or cultural symbolism could quickly become a matter of personal and territorial significance in the eyes of those who recognized his influence. The alleged disrespectful incident, often referenced in stories about this topic, is surrounded by layers of legend, oral history, and dramatized retellings rather than fully documented archival records. Many narratives suggest that during a social or mob-adjacent gathering in New York, a comment was directed toward Muhammad Ali that used language widely considered degrading at the time. Whether the exact wording and setting are historically verified or embellished over the years, the core of the story revolves around the idea of public disrespect in an environment where hierarchy and reputation were taken extremely seriously. During the 1960s, social events involving celebrities, businessmen, and underworld figures were not uncommon in major cities like New York. Nightclubs, private lounges, and exclusive gatherings often brought together athletes, entertainers, individuals connected to organized crime networks. These environments operated under unspoken rules of etiquette, where respect was expected regardless of background, and any deviation from that norm could quickly shift the tone of the entire room. The alleged remark itself, frequently described in retellings as the use of the word boy, carried heavy historical meaning. especially when directed at a grown black man of international stature. In the cultural context of the era, such language was not neutral. It echoed segregation-era attitudes and implied social inferiority. When applied to a globally recognized champion like Muhammad Ali, the insult would not have been interpreted as casual banter, but as a symbolic challenge to dignity and status. Another important aspect of the incident's narrative is the audience present. Stories often suggest that the moment did not occur in isolation, but in front of individuals connected to power structures, including figures associated with the Genovese crime family. In environments where reputation functioned as a form of currency, public humiliation or perceived disrespect could ripple outward, affecting alliances, perceptions, and future interactions between influential groups. Retellings also emphasize that Ali's public persona played a role in how such an incident would be received. Unlike many athletes of his time, he was outspoken, confident, and unwilling to accept disrespect quietly. His identity as a cultural and political symbol meant that any slight against him could be interpreted as more than a personal insult. It could be seen as a broader statement about race, power, and societal hierarchy during a highly sensitive period in American history. Within the framework of underworld culture, even verbal exchanges held strategic significance. Organized crime circles valued controlled environments where authority and status were clearly understood. A disrespectful comment toward a high-profile guest, especially one admired by a major community, could be perceived as a disruption of social balance, potentially demanding a response to restore perceived order and face. Ultimately, the alleged incident persists in historical discussions, not because of confirmed documentation of every detail, because it represents a symbolic clash between celebrity dignity, racial sensitivity, and underworld codes of respect, whether fully factual, partially exaggerated, or shaped by storytelling over time. The narrative reflects how a single moment of perceived disrespect in a charged social environment could carry consequences far beyond the immediate exchange, influencing reputations and relationships among powerful figures of that era. The meaning behind the term boy in the historical context of the 1960s cannot be understood as a simple or casual word, especially when directed at an adult black man. During the Jim Crow and post-segregation eras in the United States, the word was frequently used in a demeaning way to assert racial hierarchy and social dominance. It was not merely an insult, it was a linguistic tool rooted in a long history of racial oppression designed to strip grown men of status, maturity, and respect in public and social settings. When applied to a globally recognized figure like Muhammad Ali, the term carried even deeper symbolic weight. Ali was not just a sports champion, he was a cultural icon representing confidence, self-definition, and black pride during a time of intense civil rights struggles. Using such language toward him would not have been interpreted as humor or casual speech, but as a direct challenge to his dignity and public identity. In mid-20th century America, language functioned as a reflection of social power structures. Words were often used to reinforce invisible hierarchies in workplaces, public venues, and elite gatherings. Calling a black man boy in front of others implied inferiority and attempted to reduce his authority in the eyes of the audience. In environments where reputation and respect define status, such wording could instantly escalate tensions far beyond the surface of a single remark. The cultural climate of the 1960s also amplified the impact of such language. This was a period shaped by the civil rights movement, rising black consciousness, and a growing rejection of racially degrading norms. Public figures who embraced pride and independence, like Muhammad Ali, were especially sensitive symbols of this shift. Any perceived attempt to diminish them through language could be seen as resistance to broader social change rather than a personal disagreement. Within communities like Harlem, where local pride and cultural identity were strongly protected, the use of that term would have been interpreted as more than disrespect toward an individual. Influential figures such as Bumpy Johnson operated in environments where respect was closely tied to communal representation. An insult directed at a symbolic figure could be perceived as an insult toward the community that identified with him. The significance of the word also extended into elite and underworld social codes. In organized crime circles and high-profile gatherings, respect was a foundational rule that governed interactions regardless of race or profession. Publicly using a degrading term toward a respected guest could be viewed as a breach of etiquette and a disruption of the unspoken hierarchy that maintained order in those spaces. Ultimately, the term boy in that historical setting was not just a word, but a loaded expression shaped by decades of racial history, social inequality, and cultural resistance. Its impact depended heavily on who said it, who heard it, the environment in which it was spoken. In a tense era defined by evolving identity and strict respect codes, such language had the power to transform a single moment into a broader symbolic conflict involving dignity, status, and the defense of personal and cultural honor. Underworld codes of respect in mid-20th century New York operated as an unwritten system of law that often carried more weight than formal rules, especially within organized crime environments and influence-driven social circles. Respect was not just a matter of politeness, it was a strategic currency that defined hierarchy, alliances, and survival. A person's reputation, the way they were addressed, and how others behaved toward them in public settings all contributed to their standing within these tightly controlled power networks. Within these circles, status recognition was essential. High-profile figures, whether they were crime bosses, entertainers, or public icons like Muhammad Ali, were expected to be treated with a level of formal respect that reflected their influence and visibility. Even if individuals came from different worlds, sports, business, or organized crime, the underworld environment operated on the principle that public disrespect could destabilize relationships and damage reputations far beyond the immediate moment. Figures such as Bumpy Johnson were deeply familiar with these codes because their authority depended heavily on how consistently they enforced respect in both public and private interactions. In Harlem and beyond, Johnson's reputation was built not only on economic operations, but also on maintaining dignity in environments where power dynamics were constantly being negotiated. Allowing a public slight to go unanswered could be interpreted as weakness, which in underworld logic risked eroding long-term influence. Organized crime families like the Genovese crime family also adhered to rigid social etiquette, particularly in mixed gatherings involving outsiders, celebrities, or community figures. These environments were carefully controlled spaces where behavior signaled hierarchy. A disrespectful remark, even if spoken casually, could be seen as a breach of protocol that challenged the social balance within the room and required some form of correction, whether verbal, strategic, or reputational. Another key aspect of underworld respect codes was the importance of public image. Reputation functioned as a protective shield, and maintaining it required visible displays of composure and strength. If a prominent individual was disrespected in front of others and no response followed, it could encourage further challenges or diminish perceived authority. This is why many influential figures were highly sensitive to tone, language, and body language in social settings. These codes were also shaped by cultural context. In racially and socially divided cities like 1960s New York, respect carried additional layers of meaning tied to identity and representation. A perceived insult toward a symbolic figure could be interpreted not only as a personal affront, but as a statement about the group or community they represented. This made reactions to disrespect more calculated and emotionally charged within underworld and community leadership circles alike. Ultimately, underworld codes of respect were less about impulsive retaliation and more about maintaining equilibrium within a system built on perception, loyalty, and controlled authority. Every interaction was weighed for its long-term implications, and even a single disrespectful moment could ripple through alliances and reputations. In such an environment, language, posture, and public conduct were not trivial details, but critical signals that shaped how power was recognized and preserved. The power structure of the Genovese crime family in the 1960s was built on a rigid hierarchy that emphasized discipline, secrecy, and centralized authority. As one of the 5 families that dominated organized crime in New York, the Genovese family operated through a layered chain of command that ensured control over illegal enterprises, territorial influence, and internal loyalty. At the top sat the boss, supported by an underboss and consigliere, followed by caporgimes and soldiers who carried out operations on the ground. During this era, leadership associated with figures like Vito Genovese shaped the family's reputation for strategic control rather than public flamboyance. Unlike some other crime families that gained attention through media exposure or visible displays of wealth, the Genovese organization preferred a quieter, more calculated style of operation. This approach allowed them to maintain long-term stability while exerting influence over key economic sectors without unnecessary public scrutiny. The family's economic power came from diversified rackets, including gambling, labor unions, construction, loan, sharking, and protection networks. These enterprises were not random criminal activities, but structured systems that generated steady income and reinforced territorial authority. Their operations extended into neighborhoods with complex social dynamics, including areas connected to Harlem's underground economy, where negotiations and alliances were often necessary to maintain business continuity. Another defining element of the Genovese structure was its strict internal code of conduct. Members were expected to follow orders without public dissent, respect hierarchical rank, and avoid actions that could draw law enforcement attention. Discipline within the organization was seen as essential for survival. Any behavior that disrupted the family's reputation or stability could lead to internal consequences. This emphasis on order mirrored the broader underworld principle that power depended on perception and control rather than chaos. The family also maintained indirect relationships with influential non-Italian figures who controlled localized economic or social networks. This included power brokers in communities like Harlem, where individuals such as Bumpy Johnson operated semi-autonomously while still navigating the larger Mafia-dominated landscape. These relationships were often pragmatic, based on mutual economic interests rather than personal alignment or cultural unity. Public interactions involving high-profile personalities, including celebrities and athletes like Muhammad Ali, were handled carefully because any incident involving a public figure could attract unwanted attention. Organized crime families preferred controlled environments where social order was maintained, and unexpected tensions could threaten both reputation and operational secrecy. This made etiquette and controlled behavior especially important in gatherings where influential guests were present. Ultimately, the Genovese family's power structure in the 1960s was defined by strategic hierarchy, disciplined leadership, and calculated influence across New York's social and economic networks. Their strength did not come solely from force, from organization, alliances, and the ability to maintain authority without constant visibility. In such a system, even minor social incidents could carry broader implications if they intersected with reputation, public perception, or the delicate balance between different spheres of influence operating within the city. The political balance between Harlem and Mafia controlled networks in the mid-20th century was not defined by formal agreements, but by quiet understandings shaped through economics, influence, and survival. Harlem was a cultural and social powerhouse for Black America, yet it existed within a larger New York landscape where organized crime families, including the Genovese crime family, held significant control over underground businesses and territorial operations. This created a complex environment where cooperation and tension coexisted rather than open confrontation. Harlem's internal leadership structure differed greatly from traditional mafia hierarchies. Instead of a rigid Italian-American chain of command, power in Harlem was often localized and community-centered. Influential figures such as Bumpy Johnson acted as intermediaries who understood both the street-level realities of Harlem and the broader expectations of organized crime networks operating across New York. His role was less about submission and more about negotiated coexistence within overlapping spheres of influence. Economically, Harlem was deeply tied to informal systems such as the numbers racket, nightlife, and entertainment venues, all of which intersected with larger crime syndicates that controlled supply chains, financing, and protection structures. Rather than attempting to directly dominate Harlem culturally, Mafia families often preferred indirect control through partnerships that ensured steady revenue while avoiding unnecessary social conflict in a neighborhood with strong communal identity and cultural pride. Another key factor in this balance was the cultural significance of Harlem itself. During the 1950s and 1960s, it was not just a neighborhood, but a symbolic center of black art, politics, and intellectual life. High-profile visitors, performers, and public figures regularly passed through Harlem, making it a socially visible space that required careful management by anyone operating within its economic landscape. Any disruption in this environment could attract attention far beyond local circles. Racial dynamics also influenced how this balance was maintained. While mafia organizations controlled large-scale criminal enterprises, operated within a city experiencing major civil rights tensions and evolving racial awareness. Direct oppression or overt conflict in culturally significant areas like Harlem risked backlash, both socially and economically. As a result, interactions were often handled through diplomacy, respect codes, and strategic communication rather than overt displays of force. Public figures such as Muhammad Ali added another layer to this delicate equilibrium. When globally recognized personalities entered Harlem or interacted with influential networks connected to it, their presence carried symbolic meaning. They were seen not only as celebrities, but as representatives of pride and identity, which meant any incident involving them could potentially disturb the careful balance between community leadership and organized power structures. Ultimately, the Harlem Mafia political balance was built on mutual necessity rather than trust. Organized crime families needed stable operations and community cooperation, while Harlem's local power brokers required autonomy and respect to maintain their standing within the neighborhood. This unspoken arrangement created a fragile but functional coexistence where diplomacy, reputation, and controlled interactions were essential to preserving stability in a city shaped by overlapping systems of cultural influence and underground authority. In Underworld and influence-driven environments of the 1960s, reputation functioned as a form of currency that could be more valuable than money or territory. Unlike formal institutions where authority was defined by law or official titles, power within organized networks and street hierarchies depended heavily on how an individual was perceived by others. Respect, fear, loyalty, and credibility all combined to create a reputation that determined whether a person's words carried weight or could be ignored. For high-profile figures, reputation extended far beyond their immediate profession. Someone like Muhammad Ali was not only known for his achievements in boxing, but also for his bold personality, cultural influence, and public confidence. His reputation as a fearless and outspoken champion shaped how he was treated in social and elite environments, including spaces where celebrities, businessmen, and underworld figures occasionally intersected. Within localized power structures, individuals such as Bumpy Johnson relied heavily on reputation to maintain authority without constant displays of force. His influence in Harlem was built on a long-standing image of discipline, intelligence, and controlled strength. People followed his lead not solely because of fear, because his reputation suggested stability and protection within a community that faced economic and social challenges. In organized crime systems, reputation also played a strategic role in maintaining internal order. Families like the Genovese crime family depended on consistent perceptions of strength and reliability to prevent internal disputes and external challenges. If a leader or associate appeared weak, disrespected, or unable to enforce boundaries, it could invite opportunistic challenges from rivals or even internal dissent. Public interactions were especially critical because reputation was shaped in visible moments. A single incident in a social setting, whether respectful or disrespectful, could influence how a person was viewed across multiple networks. In tightly connected circles, stories traveled quickly, and perception often became reality. This meant that how someone was addressed, acknowledged, or treated in front of others could significantly impact their long-term standing. Reputation was also tied to community symbolism. Influential figures often represented more than themselves. They symbolized the pride, resilience, or authority of the communities they were associated with. When such a figure was disrespected publicly, it could be interpreted as a broader challenge to the group they represented, making the issue larger than a personal slight and transforming it into a matter of collective dignity. Ultimately, in environments where formal contracts and legal protections were secondary to informal power structures, reputation operated as a stabilizing force that governed behavior, alliances, and conflict resolution. Maintaining a strong reputation required consistent displays of composure, confidence, and the ability to respond strategically to perceived disrespect. In this context, even minor social incidents could carry lasting implications because they influenced the invisible but powerful economy of perception that defined authority in both community and underworld spheres. The idea of protecting cultural icons in the 1960s went far beyond simple admiration, especially in communities that saw public figures as symbols of pride, resistance, and collective identity. During this period, individuals who achieved global recognition were often viewed not just as entertainers or athletes, as representatives of social progress and dignity. Their treatment in public spaces carried symbolic meaning, and any perceived disrespect toward them could resonate deeply within the communities that identified with their success. For someone like Muhammad Ali, his role extended far beyond the boxing ring. He embodied confidence, self-definition, and a refusal to conform to societal expectations placed on black public figures of the time. As his fame grew, so did his symbolic importance, particularly among black communities who saw him as a source of empowerment during a period marked by civil rights struggles and cultural transformation. Protecting his image and dignity became, in many ways, synonymous with protecting what he represented. In neighborhoods such as Harlem, where cultural identity and community pride were deeply interconnected, influential figures often felt a responsibility to safeguard the respect of icons who inspired the public. Personalities like Bumpy Johnson operated within social systems where respect was not only personal but communal. If a figure admired by the community was publicly slighted, it could be perceived as an indirect insult to the people who looked up to that individual. The entertainment and social circuits of New York frequently brought together athletes, musicians, businessmen, and underworld figures in shared spaces like clubs, events, and private gatherings. In these mixed environments, cultural icons were expected to be treated with a certain level of courtesy regardless of differing backgrounds. Their presence elevated the social value of the setting, and their treatment reflected the host's awareness of status and influence. Another important factor was the media attention surrounding prominent personalities. Any incident involving a globally recognized figure had the potential to spread rapidly through newspapers, word of mouth, and public discussion. Organized power groups and local leaders alike understood that public controversies involving celebrities could attract unwanted scrutiny, which made maintaining respectful interactions a strategic necessity as well as a social expectation. Protection of cultural icons was also tied to broader notions of dignity during a time of racial and political change. Public figures who challenged social norms, spoke confidently, and represented marginalized communities were often seen as vulnerable to symbolic disrespect. Defending their honor, whether verbally, socially, or reputationally, became a way of reinforcing community pride and resisting narratives that attempted to diminish their significance. Ultimately, safeguarding the respect of cultural icons was about preserving symbolic power as much as personal loyalty. In an era where representation mattered deeply, the treatment of a single influential figure could reflect societal attitudes toward an entire community. As a result, protecting the dignity, image, and public standing of someone like Muhammad Ali was not merely an individual concern, a broader social act tied to identity, pride, and the defense of cultural legacy. The debate between myth and documented history is central to understanding stories that link figures like Muhammad Ali and Bumpy Johnson with dramatic incidents involving organized crime. Many narratives about the 1960s underworld were passed down through oral storytelling, memoirs, second-hand accounts, rather than official records, which makes it difficult to separate verifiable facts from later embellishments over time. Repeated retellings can transform a loosely documented encounter into a legendary event that feels historically concrete, even when primary evidence is limited. One reason myths develop so easily in this context is the secretive nature of organized crime. Groups such as the Genovese crime family operated in environments where discretion and silence were fundamental rules. Incidents involving influential figures, especially those occurring in private gatherings or social settings, were rarely recorded in official documents. As a result, much of what survives comes from anecdotes, interviews, and retrospective narratives that may reflect personal perspective more than objective history. The cultural stature of Muhammad Ali further contributed to the myth-making process. As a global icon with a bold personality and strong public presence, any story involving him naturally attracted attention and emotional interpretation. When legends portray him as a figure who faced disrespect in elite or mob adjacent environments, the narrative often becomes symbolic, representing broader themes of dignity, race, and power rather than a strictly verifiable event. Similarly, Bumpy Johnson's reputation in Harlem has been shaped as much by legend as by documented fact. Historical records confirm his influence in the numbers racket and his relationships within New York's underground economy. But many stories about his actions circulate through books, documentaries, and street lore. These accounts sometimes emphasize his role as a protector of community pride, which can lead to dramatized interpretations of how he might have reacted to incidents involving respected public figures. Media portrayals have also played a significant role in blurring the line between myth and history. Films, crime documentaries, and biographical works often adapt real events into more dramatic narratives to engage audiences. While these portrayals help preserve historical interest, they can also reinforce unverified details by presenting them in a compelling, story-driven format that audiences may accept as factual. Another factor is the broader human tendency to frame historical events through symbolic storytelling. When an incident aligns with larger themes such as respect, racial dignity, and underworld power dynamics, it becomes more memorable and more likely to be retold in increasingly dramatic ways. Over decades, these retellings can solidify into widely accepted narratives even if archival documentation remains sparse or inconclusive. Ultimately, the myth versus documented history debate does not necessarily diminish the cultural significance of the story. Rather, it highlights how history, memory, and storytelling interact. Some elements may be grounded in real social tensions and historical context, while others may be shaped by interpretation and legend. Understanding this distinction allows audiences to appreciate the narrative's symbolic meaning while remaining aware that not every dramatic detail can be fully verified through historical records. The legacy of respect, power, and symbolism connected to stories involving figures like Muhammad Ali and Bumpy Johnson ultimately reflects much more than a single alleged incident. It represents the cultural atmosphere of an era defined by shifting identity, rising pride, and deeply rooted social hierarchies. In the 1960s, respect was not a casual social courtesy, but a defining element of how influence, dignity, authority were perceived across both public and underground spheres. Muhammad Ali's legacy, in particular, transformed the meaning of personal respect on a global scale. He openly demanded to be addressed by his chosen name, spoke confidently about his beliefs, and refused to accept language or treatment that diminished his identity. This insistence on dignity elevated him from a sports champion to a cultural symbol, making any narrative about disrespect toward him resonate as a larger commentary on race, pride, and societal change during a pivotal historical period. At the same time, Bumpy Johnson's symbolic role within Harlem contributed to how such stories are remembered. Beyond his documented involvement in underground economic networks, he became a legendary figure associated with protecting community pride and maintaining balance in a neighborhood that often operated outside formal power structures. Over time, narratives portraying him as someone who would defend the honor of respected figures reinforced his image as more than just a crime boss. As a symbol of localized authority and cultural loyalty, power in that era was also deeply tied to perception. Organized groups, including major crime families operating in New York, relied heavily on reputation and controlled public image to maintain influence. Even stories of confrontation, whether fully verified or partially mythologized, served as reminders that respect and symbolism were intertwined with authority. A perceived insult toward a globally recognized figure could carry implications that extended into social, cultural, and reputational domains. Symbolism played a crucial role in how these narratives survived through generations. For many audiences, the story is less about the literal accuracy of every detail and more about what it represents, a moment where dignity confronted hierarchy and cultural pride intersected with established power systems. This symbolic interpretation allows the narrative to endure even when historical documentation remains debated or incomplete. The legacy is further shaped by how modern media, documentaries, and historical discussions revisit such stories. Each retelling adds layers of interpretation, often emphasizing themes of honor, resistance, and influence. As these narratives circulate, they evolve into cultural folklore that blends historical context with storytelling, reinforcing the enduring fascination with figures who embodied strength and presence in complex social environments. Ultimately, the lasting legacy of this narrative lies in its reflection of an era where respect functioned as a powerful social force and symbolism shaped public memory. Whether viewed through the lens of documented history or cultural legend, the story highlights how dignity, reputation, and identity were deeply interconnected in mid-20th century America. It endures not merely as a tale of conflict, as a broader representation of how influential figures came to symbolize pride, authority, and the defense of personal and cultural honor in a transformative historical moment. And that's how one disrespectful word turned into a story of power, pride, and unshakable respect. Muhammad Ali's legacy, Bumpy Johnson's authority, and the shadowy world of the Genovese family all collided in a moment that still echoes through history. Remember, in a world ruled by respect, even a single word can change everything. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more true stories that history almost forgot